Hey listeners, Christopher Cohen from QA Wolf here, and thanks for tuning in to Wolfed, the podcast that surfaces unique insights from acclaimed engineering leaders regarding how they've found success. Just a bit ago, I finished up a conversation with Tara Ellis. She's a senior engineering leader at everybody's favorite streaming giant, Netflix, but has also led teams at Disney and was a software engineer at Amazon. She's so much fun to talk to. I had a great time learning about her background, her takeaways from her leadership roles, her insights into the cultural differences at some of the mega corporations she's worked with, challenges and strategies, attracting and hiring skilled engineers, and a boatload more. This conversation was an absolute riot. I can't wait to hear what you guys think. Very stoked to have you with me today, Tara. Thank you so much for joining. And yeah, I really am excited to chat with you a bit. So I just wanted to start by hearing a little about how you first started down this path, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about your first exposure to software engineering.
Yeah, absolutely. The funny thing is, my first exposure to software engineering is so far from where I actually made the choice to move into it. So I think the first time I was exposed to it, I actually had a neighbor growing up down the street, and he had a PC in the 80s. I don't know if it was an Amiga, or Commodore 64. I can't remember. He would get the old, he would build old basic programs that would be in like computer magazines, and he would just go in and like type out all the programs on his 5.25 floppy disk, and I was like, what are you doing? But like sometimes he'd make games or he'd do stuff like that. But, I didn't have a computer growing up, so that was not an option for me. I remember asking for it every year for Christmas, but I ended up getting one. And then flash forward to, the like many, many years later, I've just graduated college, and computers had always been kind of a fascination to me, but I'd worked in a computer lab in college, but not coding, right? That was more kind of IT stuff. But I ended up getting a job in Japan. And in Japan, I ended up meeting a young, 17-year-old kid who worked across the hall from our office in an arcade. And he was like a computer hacker, and he would come over to we had like a little like cyber cafe. It was for AT&T Japan. So a cyber cafe, that's all the rage when they called it cyber. And he would come in and rent time on the computers. And over time we would chat, and he would show me neat things. And then eventually it went from websites to, oh, let's look at the source of a website, or to like, here's a CGI script. Do you know what that does? Let me tell you what that does. To eventually, going into the like, oh, did you know that you can break the encryption on software?
Wow.
And showing me like, a bunch of sites of like, you can just download anything here. And I was just like, what? I think I was 20, 22, 23 at the time, and I was totally blown away. And I'm like, I want to learn how to do that. How do you do that?
Yeah, right. So like, so now you've got this interest, it's sparked in you. So where do you go from there in order to actually get your hands on it and start learning to be a developer yourself?
Yeah, so I came back to the States, and I took a job that I absolutely hated. And the role I had at AT&T was in the marketing, and I came back into a sales role, and I learned very quickly I'm not an outside salesperson. Like, I'm just not, I can't handle the rejection. I can't do it. For the people who do that, I'm like, wow, you are stunning. I can't do it. Decided that was not for me, but I was still really fascinated by the web and the internet and all of that stuff. And so the recruiting company I was working with, so this was like 97, they decided they wanted to have their own like website and internet presence. And so while the recruiter was trying to find me a role like on the more like business end of it, I said, hey, can I build your website? Like, why don't you hire me as a webmaster? Because that's another dated term for you. And so they were like, I was cheap, right? Because I didn't have any experience. It was like a win-win. So they were like, sure, let's do it. And then I basically it was a lot of books, and then a lot of web, right? Because not everything was in print at the time. So I just really pretty much learned on the job.
And so at that point, was that experience compelling enough that you're like, okay, this is it for me. I'm doing this as a career forever, or what did that look like?
I don't know if it was forever. It probably took a little bit, because when I started off, I was mostly doing networking, which I, again, have a lot of tremendous respect for networking engineers, because you have to know a lot, right? But I didn't find it I appreciated the volume of learning, but I didn't feel, it wasn't solving the kinds of problems I wanted to solve. Right. But that's kind of where I started with the web servers and all of that. And I think, as I kept learning more information, it became clear to me that this could be viable, like a viable option for me. I went to school to make foreign policy. So I majored in international studies and German. And I thought I was going to law school, right? And so Japan was like a year detour, but my plan was to go back to law school. And what I realized is the thing between law and computers for me was, you're these two fields where you never stop learning, right? There's always new case law. There's always new things to apply. And then, in tech, like there's always a new technology. And I love to learn. So I realized, oh, wait a minute, here's another option, right? To scratch that itch that doesn't require, 3 years of law school. And so the first 2 years, I was like, okay, this is pretty interesting. In my second tech job, though, I did a lot more scripting, and that was actually when it clicked. The moment I was building like small little programs to help automate my day to day, I was just like, I don't care about the server. I want to build the scripts, and then eventually the programs, and then eventually software. Like once I got into that, that's what I was like, yeah, this is what I'm trying to do for the rest of my life.
That's amazing. Yeah, that allure of automation will sure get you.
That's what the computer's for. Like, why am I doing it?
Exactly. So tantalizing. So from there, eventually you along your journey, you ended up even at Amazon. So I'm sure there's a lot between where we're talking about and where you went there. Yeah. But like, can you think of maybe like pivotal moments that sort of shaped your path towards Amazon, or what that looked like?
Sure. Yeah. So two things. One is when I lived in Japan, I started ordering from Amazon in like 1999, 1998. Shoot, actually, I'd have been earlier. When I lived in Japan, there was one page and there was a text box, and you could put in the ASIN, right, to find, but there was nothing what it's like now, what it became. And it was a cheap way to get English books because, I could buy on Amazon and get it shipped to Japan. And it would be, I don't know, $5 or $8 or something. But if I went into a Japanese store, it would be $20, right? And so to go from that to walking, into the PacMed building in 2002 in an interview is just such like a mind-blowing thing. I'm like, I was such an early adopter of this company, and now I'm interviewing here, But I think that the pivotal moment, as I was living on the East Coast, I'm from the East Coast originally, I'd been working in a job, and I had just left the job actually at Hoboken, and I was back working in the Philadelphia area, and I had been doing I had been working on a full Microsoft stack at the time, doing more like straight up application development. And COM objects and DLLs and it's awful. But business applications. And September 11th happened. And it was definitely a moment for me. I was still in Pennsylvania when that happened. And so like when the plane disappeared, in Pennsylvania, no one knew where it was. They sent us all home, and then watching everything on the news. And I had worked, in Hoboken, right across the Hudson. I used to go in the World Trade Center all the time. Oh, so it was so impactful. It was one of those moments of the recognition of life is short. And so why are you, life is too short to be working on things you don't want to be doing, And so I kind of decided, that day that I was leaving, I was going to leave the East Coast, and it still took me like probably about a month or like a couple months to do it. But, I looked at Seattle, DC, San Francisco, and Austin, and the choices were because I had friends who lived in all of those cities. And so the Seattle friend, offered me the best deal. Stay here, split half the rent, and I'll pay for everything else till you find a job. And he worked at Amazon, which was kind of crazy. At the time, he'd been there 5 years at the time. So
wow.
So he'd been there a long time. Yeah. So I ended up coming out there, staying with him. And it's different now, but at that time, Amazon they had a cycle of like 5 years and 2 years. Like when you're 5 years when your options vested, people would retire or leave or what have you. So I went to a retirement party for a friend of his and started talking to a web developer who was like, you should give me your resume. I'll refer you for a job. And at the time I was like, there's no way they're going to hire me, right? I've been on the Microsoft stack the last 5 years. They're all open source. And so, but I love this company, right? I'm an avid customer. So I'm like, sure. I would not have actually voluntarily applied because I just didn't think that they would have looked at me.
Oh, no way.
Yeah. So I did. And then a couple months later, I got a call from a recruiter and it was kind of a perfect fit for my background. They were kind of doing a hybrid team where the engineering team sat in Seattle and the business team sat in France. And so they wanted people who had international working experience. And I had lived in Germany and I had worked in Japan. Right. So like I was checking a lot of boxes because they're like, oh, you know how to work with people who are from different cultures. And I ended up getting a call. And so that's how I ended up there.
That's incredible. One of those amazing things of so many different pieces of your past kind of lining up. So many.
Absolutely.
Right? Just it ended up being the right fit. And so as like you said, a very early adopter, I mean, you had this view of Amazon. You knew what it was like as a user back then. But of course, now here it is, the early 2000s, and you're actually working there. What does this look like at the time when, like, now, of course, Amazon's going through this massive transformation? And what were maybe some of the things you might have been privy to that you can let us in on?
Yeah. We were at the massive transformation part. That came 2 years after I started.
Gotcha.
So let me tell you, this was my personal favorite. There was an internal homegrown language called CatSubst, which was basically a macro language that was built out of .cpp files that was loaded into the. I'm not even going to get into all that. Anyway, and I remember the first day there was a bug. So I got assigned a bug to fix, right? The rite of passage of the first day. And I've read the documentation and I could not for the life of me figure out like why this thing was working. And so after like an hour, which I have a rule, it's 20 minutes. You don't know in 20 minutes, you need to ask somebody. Yeah. But anyway, an hour, I talked to the engineer. I'm like, why is this not working? I'm literally following the example and whatever. And he's like, you have made the mistake. You have made the mistake that you think this is a language. This is not a language. This is a macro. And he puts a space in between one character and the equal sign. And I was like, you have got to be kidding me. What did I sign up for?
Exactly. You're like, maybe Amazon's not the right fit for me after all. No, I'm sure.
There was that. There was they were using Perl at the time, which I hadn't used Perl since like 97. So now I'm like, and I'm like, oh, like, what's the debugger? Like, how do I coming from the Microsoft development world, you can say whatever you want for their products, but their development tools, their developer tools are fantastic. And so I'm just like, where's I want to set a breakpoint, or like, I want to go through a stack trace. How do I do this? And they're like, print F.
Whoo!
I was just like, what is happening?
So a bit of an adjustment.
It was a little bit, but I do think the hidden skill set I think you learned at Amazon, at least back in that time, it's not just the working at scale, right? But you will learn how to debug. And that is a fantastic, irreplaceable skill, understanding how to debug quickly under pressure.
I mean, right? Yeah. I have to imagine that applies to just about every role as an IC. So yeah, in the tech world, that's like you said, that's an invaluable experience from Amazon, right?
The faster you can get that skill set, the more valuable you will be, because there's a lot of people who don't understand how to debug. You'd be like, okay, let's start from the beginning. Let's use a system here.
It's what a developer spends most of their time doing. So we should all have enough practice getting great at it, but yeah.
Right.
So I'm curious that, your transition from kind of being an IC to your first leadership experience, what did that look like? And I know eventually you ended up at Disney, working for the Parks and Resorts Technology Division. Was that your first leadership experience, or was there something in between?
So, yes, by my reckoning, I would say there's something in between. It's the first time I had the title of manager. but I had been a tech lead before coming to Disney at a small start, like I say, weren't that small, 30-person startup that I had worked at very briefly. And for about 7 months, actually, yeah, we won't go into that story. Anyway, and that was what I would consider kind of my first like real leadership role. And like when I say leadership, I mean from the perspective of being responsible for kind of like the technical delivery, mentoring, code quality, that kind of stuff, and really being the person who was the front line, like, okay, what are we doing here? And then how do I get the team? But not responsible for their careers, right? Which is like different for me, like than the manager role.
Sure.
And so, yeah, so I was there. I had 4 engineers that I was working with where I was a tech lead of. And I spent a lot of time, helping them get through. They were all pretty senior, so it wasn't like I had to teach them how to do things, but it was more around trying to think holistically around like the system and what we needed to do and how to again solve problems. Right? That's a great idea. It's a really awesome algorithm. It doesn't solve this problem over here. Right? Right? Like the difference between getting the brilliance into the like we still have to produce a business outcome.
Right. Exactly. So
yeah.
I mean, what was that transition like for you as you were used to being an IC for a while and now you're working, maybe above people, let's say.
Yeah.
I mean, did it feel like a natural fit for you? Was there a big learning curve?
Yeah. I will die on this hill that any person who wants to go in management should be a lead first, right? Because you will make a lot of awful mistakes. It is not an easy transition, but it's easier than going from an IC to manager. Yeah, it's like that's a bigger jump, and I think a lot of people underestimate actually how big that jump is. So this is like a little jump in between. I will say, what you learn and the overlap is, you're only used to thinking about yourself, right? You're only thinking about like your world and how things impact you. And so if people aren't you, then they must be wrong, right? Like if they're not, coding 100 hours a week, then they must be wrong, right? Or if they're not like, doing the exact same, they didn't solve it the exact same way you solved it, they must be wrong, right? And so like learning a little bit of, humility around the fact that like there's a lot of different ways to solve problems, right? And as long as something is not objectively wrong, like I'll give you an example. I'm not a big PHP person, but this company was using PHP. But I'd worked with people who knew PHP really, really, really well, right? I'm like, I can be effective with PHP versus I know that language inside.
Sure.
And I remember getting a code review comment about string interpolation, right? The single quote versus the double quote. And they're like, you should be using, I can't remember what it was now, but at the time, but they're like, you should be using basically the double quote here and not the single quote. And it felt to me like a subjective thing. Right. And so I no subjective comments. You don't have to like it. As long as there's not an objective reason, just keep it moving. And I was like, this feels like a subjective thing. Right. And the person's like, well, actually how it ends up compiling is very different. Right. And it changes, the runtime of it. And I was just like, okay. That is an objective reason that I am fine changing that, right? Learning that nuance, right? When you're doing someone's code reviews, put your ego aside. Like if I'm not giving them a reason for why this thing, will impact the performance. Oh, look, I had a gesture there. Okay. Then I'm not going to say it, right? So I think I spent, and also just, you get very micromanaging. You have to learn to not be a micromanager, and it's better to not be in a position where you have a manager's power to learn that lesson.
That makes sense. And I mean, like you said, you're so used to focusing on yourself that once you're in a position of, well, these other folks are in your purview, maybe the instinct is to micromanage at first because it's almost like, well, this is under my auspices, so I want to be. So yeah, that's probably a learned skill.
I must control everything so we are successful.
Exactly. But of course, as you scale to bigger and bigger positions, you've got more and more people under you. Yeah, it doesn't make sense. You have to learn to trust folks.
I have seen the flip side. It's very rare. I would say 90% of the time people go to the micromanager, but 10% of the time you get the people who go the whole other end and they won't make a decision. Right. And they'll just be like, They'll just exactly just as bad. They're like, well, we got to get together. Like, what is the team? What does it do? What is the team? What do they do? And I'll quote. I don't know if this friend of mine will ever hear this, but if he does, he'll recognize it. I'll quote something a good friend of mine said to me once when I was complaining about something. He said, "Tara, leaders lead. Stop complaining and go lead." And so if you're on that 10%, like you got to make decisions. You're leading.
It's right there in the name. It turns out leaders lead.
Exactly.
Well, so then you kind of made this distinction of, okay, well, at Disney, this is your first opportunity where you actually have this title of manager, and it's more than just being a tech lead. It is, you're kind of making a different caliber of decisions. So what were those learnings now this time around? And maybe were there even big mistakes that you made here that shaped how you thought about being an engineering leader moving forward?
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Luckily, so I did have the fortune of being a tech lead at the startup and at Disney. So I got to do it with a team of 4, and then I got to do it with a team of like 13. And then on top of that, I moved before becoming a manager, I had moved into a staff role, right? A staff engineer role. So then that was more organizational, right?
Gotcha.
So again, like a little less of a jump, but I'll tell you I think the two big learnings once I moved into that. One was, and it's something I still grapple with as I continue to move into different, more senior roles, is understanding power, right? Understanding how your words have power, right? And how when I said a thing as a senior engineer versus if I said the same thing as a staff engineer versus if I said the same thing as a manager, very different responses, and as someone who tends to have a more casual leadership style, I've had to be very careful about, I'm just saying this thing, off the cuff, assuming that, yesterday we were peers and like now I'm your, maybe I'm your lead or I'm your boss. And it should be the same, but it's not the same. Right? And if you're careless with your words, you can cause a lot of angst in the people who are following you.
I think this is something that a lot of people struggle with as they ascend into more leadership roles, and especially when you're working somewhere where you were just peers a moment ago. Have you found effective ways to draw that line or to keep those kinds of relationships healthy when that dynamic changes?
Yeah, I mean, I am, to be honest with you, I think I was lucky when I moved into a lead role, I was in the same team. When I in a staff role, the same. When I moved into a manager role, I moved teams, and I always try to tell people, don't manage the team you're on if you can avoid it. It's just really hard, and especially if this is the first time you're doing it, like it's just so fraught. Right. So try to go to a different team if you can. But if you can't, then you have to have, and this is again, another rookie mistake, that I had to learn. You have to be very explicit about the shift in roles and responsibilities. So for example, I'm working with people who were, actually, I have a really, really close friend. We're still really good friends to this day, who I worked with at Amazon. Actually, we were peers at Amazon and worked on many great projects together. And then I hired her as a tech lead when I was at Disney. So she was working for me, right? And I mean, luckily we've known each other for years. But I had to have a very candid, like, you're my bud, you're like one of my best friends, you always will be that. But when we are in this space, right, like well, there's a line, right, that we have to have, right? Because it's not fair to the other people. It's confusing to like how our interactions are. And like, and so I think it's really imperative that you have to set that line and you have to be transparent about it and just say, like, let's just all recognize that this is what is happening.
Yeah.
And like, how do we now work together in a way that nobody feels, like hurt about it?
So you're addressing the elephant in the room very directly.
You gotta do it.
I mean,
I think addressing the elephant in the room is 99% of the time the answer for everything.
I was just going to say, it's very rare that open, honest, and direct communication does not
Yeah.
yield the results that it should. So
Yeah.
that sounds like this is a great example of that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and now here you are at Netflix. And I mean, I don't know if there's anything in particular that you might want to talk about in terms of that transition from Disney to
Yeah.
Netflix.
Yeah.
Is there anything?
Oh, I tell you.
I'll leave it up to you.
It was like literally Netflix was the antithesis culturally of Disney. Like you could not, they were like such opposite ends of the spectrum that it was everyone experiences culture shock when they come to Netflix because it has a very particular culture. But I feel like I got like a double whammy because it was so far removed from, Disney, 100-year-old company, not a tech company. I mean, Bob Iger's been very tech forward, right? But for the most part, like that's not how that works.
Mm-hmm.
I worked in the parks org, right? Which is in some ways great because that's where a lot of the money, like the consistent cash flow comes from. So,
Yeah.
But very, it's all centered around physical things, right? And so that's, and I'm living in a software world, right? And so that translation sometimes was really difficult. And it was a very top down kind of culture, right? And sometimes that made sense to me and I'm like, okay, I get it. And then sometimes I'm like, there's so many smart people here. Just let them run. Like,
Mm-hmm.
like every hack day, it would be like, look at the stuff that they're coming up with. Like, and then I come to Netflix where people were just, I remember, I don't know, it was my first week or second week. I was talking to my boss about something and I was like, why do we do this thing that way? This feels really inefficient. And he's like, well, then change it.
You're like
And
me?
I was like, wait, what? He's like, I mean, if you don't want to do it that way, don't do it that way. And it was like so much freedom.
And
Right?
so I'm curious from your perspective, like, how did that feel like a fresh breath of air? And do you prefer things that way? And B, as a people leader, do
Yeah.
you find that bestowing that autonomy upon your team gets you the results more often than not?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. I like that one. Okay. So the first part of that question, let me just say it's a oxymoron because at first it's a breath of fresh air and then it's terrifying, right? I spent a lot of my earlier career basically saying, give me the ball, give me the ball, give me the ball, give me the ball. I know where we need to go. Give me the ball. Right. And then I get someplace where they're like, well, here's the ball. Right. And now you're like, oh God, do I know what to do with the ball? Maybe I don't know what to do with the ball. Maybe I was completely wrong. Right. And I think that that freedom is very crippling once you have it until you get over the hump. Right. That's like, it's okay. There's a reason why you're here. You do actually know how to carry the ball, right? But you're so used to the resistance, that it takes it adds this weird effect, right? It's like an up and then a down and then an up again. I do believe that kind of autonomy is important, but I do think it has to come with a little bit of guardrails, right? And what I mean is, they should have full autonomy to solve the problem in the way that they see fit. They should also understand my expectations of what success looks like. And they should also understand what accountability means there. Right. And so if I don't make all of those parameters clear, then they're not going to do their best work. Right. And they're going to kind of be kind of led astray or perhaps do something that is not the right thing for Netflix. Right.
Gotcha.
But if you're really clear about hey, I trust you. Again, you are here because you have a skill that we think is great, right? And we trust that you know how to use it. Here's the box a little bit, like here's what we got to hit so we know what it looks like, and here's what happens if we don't. So let's come up with some plans, right? What our backups are. And again, is that like you can do that, right? I'm not driving that for them. I'm just saying you got to cover these bases. I tell my team 95, and this is true, 95% of the time, I don't ever tell them how to solve a problem. But 5% of the time, I'm like, we need to do it this way. And when that happens, I'm just like, I never say that.
Right.
So if I'm saying that, there's a reason.
Exactly.
know?
That's lovely. So I'm sure that gives them even more faith in that, like, well, we know that we can take the ball and run with it ourselves in most of these
Right.
cases. So let's do it this way, this time.
I mean, the people closest to the code most of the time should be making the decisions.
Think that makes sense. I
Yeah.
would hope most people wouldn't argue with that.
You'd be surprised, I tell you. Like, why are you designing this? Have you even checked out the code? Like, stop.
So I want to take a little bit of a step back because we're talking about now, as you've had more and more experience actually leading teams, managing teams, going to more senior positions. So I'm curious, as you've garnered this experience, how you viewed leadership in the tech world in the context of engineering, and what qualities do you think are like absolutely essential for being an effective leader in such a fast-paced industry?
I feel like I'm always still learning, right? You never really stop. And I was thinking back to a thing you had asked before, kind of what did you learn when the mistakes that were made when you moved into just like the manager role, right? Because frontline management is different than managing managers, And so it was interesting to get into that role as a frontline manager and to manage a team and learn how to execute through them, right? I had another colleague who gave me a great metaphor for it. When you're an engineer, you're driving the car. When you're a manager, you're sitting in the passenger seat with the app being like, you have a left coming up, up above and a quarter miles, right? Like you're navigating, but you're not driving the car,
Right.
And getting comfortable with just, making sure we don't miss our exit versus, plotting everything out. But then when you're managing, so I went from that to then when I'm managing multiple teams, and at the time I had 3 tech leads reporting to me. And for all intents and purposes, like they managed the day-to-day of those teams. One team sat with me in Seattle, one team was in Orlando, and one team was in Argentina. So I'm not physically there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they were the ones who were driving that. And just I learned I understood pretty quickly how different I needed to be with them, to influence through them what I needed the team to do, but also to get out of their way of being leaders, right? Because we were sharing that a bit, right? That leadership thing. And so it was hard. It was hard. I feel like that was because there was no practicing for that, right? At least as a tech lead, you get a portion of the manager job you could practice. This was very different. And so here I am again, right? Moving from, like I've doubled the size, more teams, more managers, and, trying to make sure as a leader, like trying to understand where I need to be at each level. So maybe when I'm managing a team, it's like, okay, we're very in there. I'm in here with you. We're here together and I'm telling you where to go. And maybe when I'm managing, multiple teams, it's a little more diffuse, but ultimately, it's kind of like where we need to go. Now we have many teams, many managers. Now the conversation is more about, I'm not in the weeds at all, right? I'm not solving those problems, right? I'm making sure that like our values and understandings as an organization are passed down, but I'm looking this way, right? I'm trying to say like strategically, where do we need to be, year to year and what have you. And so it's just at every level, the job completely changes. You're just starting all over again.
So, and you'd say that like each of these levels come with their own specific skill sets that need to be learned, need to be maybe even adjusted as you get more experience.
Yeah. So certainly there's overlap. Certainly there's overlap, right? So like for me, like I think skills that are really important to me that I think that have made me effective is what you see is what you get. I'm very transparent, right? And I'm very honest, but I don't tell them everything, right? Like, and that's a line. But I make that very clear. I always say to people, I will not lie to you, but I will not tell you everything because I cannot tell you everything. Like, that's not how this works, right? But what I can tell you, I will tell you. And what I can't, there's a reason and you have to be okay with that, So like, that kind of honesty or that kind of transparency. And I think my teams end up trusting me that if, especially if there's big organizational things that are happening, if I'm saying, hey, this is what's happening, people tend to be more like, okay, we have feelings about it, but okay. I think empathy is important. I have not forgotten what it's like to be an engineer. And I have not forgotten what it's like to be an engineer when I feel like leadership thinks I'm stupid. Like, and says things that I'm like, what? Why do you think, you think we're dumb? Like, we can see the earnings call. Like, why, so I feel like that empathy makes sure that I don't try to ever blow smoke up their butts. Right. Like,
Right.
I try to be very, very clear. But then I also try to be, I think expectations are really important. And this is something I feel like I've grappled with. It's a very hidden thing. I see a lot of leaders at every level, but especially newer ones, are not clear on what success looks like, and what they need from their teams and what high performing actually means. And so you end up, with a lot of, if you're in a place that's very structured and you have like a lot of criteria that you can check a box, like, okay, great, you can lead that way. But I don't know if I think that's really leadership.
So because I guess what I would also ask you about is, I mean, and you really just made me think of this with your answer a moment ago, as you said, it takes a lot of empathy to be a great engineering leader. And so I wonder where this falls. Did we get it? Go for it.
Yeah, I remember now. Sorry. So what he had said was, this is the counterpoint. It's not a counterpoint. It goes along with the empathy. Your job is to be the bad guy. Right. And like, I don't think anyone would work for me and said I'm a bad guy, but sometimes I have to deliver hard things, and there's no getting around that. And if you have the empathy of what it felt like to receive that, you're not going to like start off a conversation like trying to blow smoke up their butt, right? You're going to be like, I know how this sounds, but like, we got to have real talk.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, and I guess it makes me wonder, because of course the tech world is filled with engineering leaders and even higher level leaders of all kinds of backgrounds, from all different walks of life. Many of them do have an engineering background and many don't. And so I wonder, how you feel about if you've had personal experience working for folks who have not been engineers prior, and can you still be an effective tech leader without that background, in your opinion?
It really depends on the company and the size of the company and what you're doing, right? Because when I think about a place like Disney, so like my first boss who hired me at Disney, also someone I was friends with we knew each other for years at Amazon. He was very technical, but he had been a C++ programmer. So while he was intensely technical, he did not do any UI stuff at all. Gotcha. Right? So he wasn't really going to talk to me about like cutting edge JavaScript clients I'm making, right? Like I could have, we could have philosophical design questions about systems. And I often would actually talk with him about that because, that was kind of the world he dabbled in, but he wasn't going to be able to tell me about specific language things. So, so while he was technical, it still was kind of a different thing. But I do think that there was an empathy around problems, right?
Yeah.
That he still had. Because he had been an engineer.
That makes sense. And it's an interesting topic because I've spoken about it with a few other folks on various episodes. It does seem like most people who end up in an engineering leadership position do come from that background, but not always. And they've certainly sometimes we work for people who do, sometimes we don't. And I've heard of different thoughts. Some people think it's really, at the end of the day, management's management, leadership's leadership, and you don't necessarily need that background. But some people are pretty passionate about, well, no, you got to start there.
Maybe it's a frontline manager. It's harder to not have that background, right? Because again, depending on the company, right? So at Netflix, managing at Netflix, we used to have no levels and it was all senior engineers. And when I came to Netflix from Disney, at Disney, I had managed literally from interns to staff engineers, like all the way. And then I come into Netflix and everyone's senior and everyone's like, Like, I'm not talking like I'm 4 years in and I'm senior. I'm talking like 10 plus years
Right.
or more and I'm senior. And I was literally like, what is my job? Because there's nothing technical they need from me. Like these people were all experts. And so I was like,
Gotcha.
My first 4 months, I literally sat around being like, I don't know what my job is. I don't know what my job is.
Yeah, and what did you end up landing on once you realized that, like, well, it's not technical advisement these people
Exactly,
need.
right?
What did they need?
Yeah, so I mean, what they needed, and it's funny, some of that I found out because I asked them directly, right? Like, in my first 3 months, how can I be like the best manager for you? What can I do for you? What is the things that are really driving you crazy? So first off, for them, it was the team was completely inundated. It was like in a new space. We had a ton of like business that we were trying, so many things we were trying out, and it was in the payment space, but specifically Netflix had started off piloting this like partnership, so we partnered with later on, but still one of the big ones was like Comcast and like T-Mobile and like other ISPs and other like other companies like outside the country, like Orange or LG or what have you. And so it was just kind of like, it was all a brand new business line, right? And so there was just pent up demand, and we were the first kind of small team. And so the team was basically getting constantly, like I said, inundated. And they were like, we just need someone to be a firewall first
Right.
off so we can get stuff done, right? That was just kind of number one. And then number two, to provide a little bit of structure, like prioritizing, right? If they have 4,000 things coming at them and they don't know what is the most important, like what do you work on here versus when you work on that versus what have you. And so doing like the more kind of technical project management parts of the job, as they were like, please help us, please help me, right? So that was like the first immediate thing. But then the next thing that also was important is like managing their careers or helping them manage their careers, right? Like I explain this, I try to explain this to other leaders, is that you have to respect like the altitude of hierarchy, right? Where I sit in the organization changes what I see and what I have access to, right? So my director sees across way more of the company than I do, right? And her VP sees ways more across the company than she does. And so the thing is, you should be utilizing those different levels to find opportunities for people internally. Because if you just keep looking at your level, you're never going to see, you're just not going to be able to tell kind of what's out there. And so, and trying to make sure that my team is talking to me about the things that they care about in their careers. Where do you want to go? What do you want to learn? What's growth look like for you? Some people growth looks like grow my paycheck. Some people growth looks like I want a fancy title. Some people growth looks like I want to get better at public speaking. It's like it could mean anything. But trying to have really explicit conversations and then partnering with them to make that happen. Like that's a thing only I can really do, right? In my space with them. And so that's the kind of stuff I started like focusing on more. And then of course from the tactical side, right? Like once I ramped up, I didn't take them to every technical meeting. That just doesn't scale, right? So like I did need to be able to go and do like high level swags and then bring it back to the team and talk to them about that stuff. So it took a while for me to realize that, but I was so used to being in the whole, like, let me solve this technical problem for you. Right. And then it was like, we don't need that. We need this over here.
Which, I mean, once again, sort of comes back to that, like you ended up finding the answer through that honest, direct communication, right? Addressing it directly. How can I help? What do you need? Am I going to best serve you as your manager? Which is great. I think, I want to shift a little bit because I'm just curious to ask you about something that's so, I think one of the most difficult things that so many engineering leaders face, which is this balance between, hey, we've got these deadlines to hit, we've got products to deliver, and at the same time, we're in a fast-moving tech industry where we want to be latching on to the latest, greatest, newest thing, and maybe even just building that ourselves. So when it comes to managing your own teams, how do we sort of strike this balance between fostering innovation, but still focusing on, hey, well, this has to get done by this date, or otherwise we're going to have angry people?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a balance, right? You have to start with the first principle, right? That like we work for a business, right? And we are here to make money. And no matter how cool a thing is, if it doesn't end up in that at some point, it's not a good use of our time, right? So like, so there's just that, but this might be useful. When I worked in partnerships and payments, it was interesting because you had these two sides of the business that were diametrically opposed, right? So payments, it's very clear. Like, we're going to use this payment type or what have you in this country, or we're going to use this method of payment, or we're going to do this thing because this will have the most revenue impact. More people will pay because they like to use that thing, right? And so, and even though we're testing and experimenting, it's still it's yes or no. Did it move the needle or not, right? But then on the partnership side, we're going to do this type of sign up flow with, um, you know, T-Mobile because we think, right, it might bring this user in and hold on to them longer later, right? Like, but we don't really know, right? And so on the partnership side, it was almost all innovation, right? And then on the payment side, it was like, I don't want to say it was operations, but it was definitely very, like, push this lever, make this money, right?
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
and very clear. And if the only consideration was, well, what makes the money, payments would always clobber partners. There's no way, right, that
Yeah.
it's going to win. But you still need to make these innovation bets because you never know which one is actually going to take off, right? And so Netflix is very forward thinking that way, right? In the sense of like, yeah, we have to keep the lights on. We have to do more than keep the lights on, and we need to generate money. And, we have a very core business, and we need to be 5 to 10 years ahead of our competition. And if we don't have efforts that invest in looking into that, then we won't be there. And we're willing to take a little less profit in the short term, right? If that gives us the profit in the longer term, right? And so I think like that's the kind of balance you're looking for. The like, we're still a business. We don't get to we're not a research center, right?
Right. Yeah.
But at the same time, we'll never get out of this hole if we don't try to take a few bets a year and focus on those.
That's awesome. In the tech world today, and really everywhere, we're trying to put as much emphasis on diversity and inclusiveness as possible when it comes to hiring, when it comes to building diverse teams of people with all different kinds of backgrounds and perspectives. And it's not easy to do all the time. And I'm curious if that's something that's been a priority to you, if you've been able to promote that sort of initiative within your own organization.
Mm-hmm. Ooh. Trying to get me in trouble.
Yeah. You're allowed to say pass for the record. We can just say pass and we'll move.
I love this question. Yeah, I have very passionate opinions about this. Diversity means so much, right? Like, in addition to like the more like traditional, definitions, it's also like people think differently. People regionally. I lived in Japan. I lived in Germany. They think very differently than I do, right? Their culture is very different, right? People have different backgrounds, economic backgrounds, educational backgrounds, and all of these things. You cannot get a better, more fuller opinion if you don't have all those people in the room, right? And so to me, it's just a no-brainer. What I find frustrating is that I think a lot of people, especially in Silicon Valley in particular, there's this like, well, we just get a pipeline problem. We just can't find people. And I'm just like, okay. Can you throw a stone at anyone? No. That would be true, right? Because the demographics of the area are as they are, right? But it is a little bit of recognition that it might take you a couple weeks longer, but you should still wait. And I think for me, I really try to double down on having diverse pipelines, right? As long as I see whatever 5 different dimensions of representation in my pipeline, I don't know what that is, right? I don't have a set criteria.
Sure.
It's then I'm good. And then, whoever is the best candidate wins. But I'm never going to get to having a diverse team if I don't even start with a diverse pipeline. And I'll wait. Like, I'm just like, we'll just wait. I mean, and I have a track record of building diverse teams across gender, across age. I've had like 20 to 60-year-olds, like across race, like across education, formal versus self-taught, right? Big company versus small company, right? Like, so, I mean, it requires a commitment, but I've done it every time, so I don't want to hear it. Every team I've made, but, and I think you just get better teams. And I think the teams really like it because like people get challenged in a good, positive way. It keeps everybody gets on their toes. They're like, this is exciting. It's like this energy,
That's so great. I'm glad to hear that you've been able to navigate that with success, building successful, diverse teams.
I will say,
go ahead.
I should add this too quickly. I am spoiled. Like at Netflix, I feel like every time I've been in a position of hiring, I have done this. In some companies, it's been harder than others, right?
Mm-hmm.
I feel very spoiled at Netflix, and I think Netflix has made a very concerted effort, like organizationally, to say like this matters and inclusion is a value, right? Like period. And so we are going to double down on that, right? And so when you have that kind of level of support, it's an easier conversation than being like the only person in the room that has to be like, I guess I'm just gonna have to pirate this,
right?
Totally. But I'm gonna make it happen.
Well, that's lovely to hear. I'm glad that you felt you've had that support. Because I mean, I'm curious just in general, like obviously, and especially right now with the job market for engineers being what it is, trying to find those really skilled engineers who are going to be a really valuable addition to your team out of the sea of applicants has got to be very difficult. And I know, and again, especially when we're considering things like we also want people from all different kinds of backgrounds and walks of life. I mean, do you have go-to strategies for how you attract the right people that you want on your team?
Yeah, that's so interesting. So we used to be a completely bespoke like hiring process. Like I ran the whole thing, right? I had a recruiting partner. We worked together. I was expected to resource or look for research and find candidates as well as they were, right? But we would sit together. We would come together with some sort of criteria, right? And sometimes there's stuff like they need to have this many years of experience. Some people like they need to have this language. I tend to like, I wouldn't say like, you have to know Java. I would say like, you need to know an object-oriented language, right? Mm-hmm. Like, because my thing is that like, you learn, you're smart, right. You can learn. Like, I don't need you to, I just need, I tend to cast a wider net from that perspective of you need to hit a certain sort of archetype, right? And then we can narrow down from there. And then I also made it very clear to my recruiting partners that I'm like, do not send me 400 of the same thing. Because I will absolutely just say, this is literally the same person, just at this company versus this company. This is not going to work for me. I actually, one counterpoint I did once where I had a team of extroverts. I was like, I would like someone a little quieter, right? And not because I think they still need to be forceful. They still need to be whatever, but this team needs to understand how to communicate with people who have different styles, right? So, and like trying to find a little more of like that kind of composition for the team.
That's absolutely excellent point. So I mean, I honestly, you're so much fun, Tara. I could talk to you for another 3 hours.
I feel like I'm not adding.
I think it's very useful. Despite all the other things I want to ask you, I will focus on one last thing I want to ask you. And it's another broad question, but I do like to end with this because I know there are so many people out there who aspire to end up in positions like yourself. I'm wondering if you have a piece of advice you might distill down where you could say, hey, if you're looking to become an engineering leader, even maybe add a massive logo like Netflix, what does it take to get there?
I think like anything else, right? It's no different. It's just really about, you have to learn your craft. I didn't have the luxury of, getting out of Carnegie Mellon or MIT or Stanford with a degree, right? But yet I still ended up at Amazon, which I was there for 7 years, right? And then ended up here. And did it take me longer? Sure. Did I get that job out of college? Absolutely not. I wasn't qualified. But 5 years in, when I had made it a point to like not only curate, but really learn how to be an excellent engineer, right? That's what got me through the door, right? And so I think a lot of people move into manager roles for the wrong reasons. I try to tell people, stop. It's not a race. You don't need to be in a rush. You'll be a better manager if you learn your craft. You know, I was an engineer for like 16 years before I became a manager, right? So I was so maybe like 5 of those 16 was as a tech lead, but still I was just like, when I did not make the shift until the people problems became more interesting than the technical problems. And that is when you should shift. if you do it before, then you're gonna be unhappy. Your team's gonna be unhappy. It's gonna be a hot mess. But if you spend the time, you recognize it is a different job with a different skill set that you have to learn. Learn it, get really good at it, right? And then you can work anywhere, right? But that's pretty much how that goes.
You know what? It's like when I pitched that question, I know it's so broad, and I know that it's such a difficult thing to answer on the spot. Yeah. But what's so amazing is that what we often come away with is something like what you just said. You want to become a manager when the people problems become more interesting than the technical problems. And it's like, what a brilliant way to distill down a signal for someone in terms of like, right. Does this make sense for me? Am I in a position where I'm ready for this move? So I appreciate that you dug deep for me and found something, because I think that's an amazing nugget. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Because otherwise, again, as much as I want to steal your entire Friday night away from you, I will let you go. Thank you so much for joining us today, Tara. I really, really appreciate it. And I hope to watch your career continue to evolve and see where you go next.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll see you guys next time.